to our third webinar, joining people from various places, from Vienna, Tunis, Paris, Aix-en-Provence. We're very delighted to have people from a number of places. My name is Nadia Al-Bagdadi, and I'm happy to moderate tonight's seminar. This third seminar is dedicated to special theme and issues which are pertinent to the larger framework of our research project, striking from the margins, from disintegration to reconstitution of state and religion in the Middle East. The project that, of which this is part, is an international research project integrating researchers as well as policymakers from the Middle East, Europe, and the US in various capacities and in various functions. The project is based in Vienna at the Center for Religious Studies at Central European University, and is made possible by generous support that we receive from the Carnegie Corporation of New York and its transnational movements in the Arab region program, for which we are very grateful. As many other initiatives, we had to take refuge to the online version, but do so with also enjoying the benefits that it has, that so many people from different places can join who otherwise would not be able to attend the monthly seminar. Today's seminar contributes to one of the three research foci that we pursue in the project, namely the focus on pertinence of gender regimes under conditions of continuing conflict, which addresses gender issues that have everywhere been symptomatic, as well as the connecting tissue between a number of seemingly disparate social practices and attitudes. It looks at gender relations, which are the locus of social engineering and the reconstitution of the body social. And this third seminar is precisely described to investigate and to highlight the kind of research that is necessary in order to have a better understanding of this reconstitution. Field notes from the Neighbourhood, Gender and Transformation in Libya, in Syria, is dedicated and inscribed to this most recent history, the post-2011, and will address this question and the question of the post-revolutionary from a different angle than we've addressed it in a couple of other seminars hitherto. Marking the 10th anniversary, narratives of success and failure related to the 2011 uprising in North Africa and the Middle East have been particularly ubiquitous this year, as many of you are participating actively in contributing to in public debates and scholarly debates and else. Departing from the perspective, not denouncing the perspective at all, but departing from these perspectives, the seminar tonight draws attention to long-term transformative processes that are happening at an intimate scale with a focus on Libya and Syria. The discussion that we will have tonight will explore the ways in which gender roles and relations are being reconfigured as part of and in response to revolution and displacement. Based on the ethnographic fieldwork in Tunis and Turkey and Syria and Libya, where large numbers of Libyans and Syrians respectively have taken refuge since 2011, our distinguished speakers tonight, anthropologists and historians, will provide granular perspectives on the ways in which women understand and engage in political and societal change. How are women making sense of and bargaining across a multiplicity of authorities in their everyday lives? How do they form networks of mutual aid and employment while establishing themselves in the immediate vicinity of their home countries, often in neighborhoods populated by other Syrians or Libyans? And finally, what are their political and social imaginaries for a future Libya and a future Syria? Any such response to these questions rests on skilled and well-crafted research on the ground. The discussion, therefore, will reflect upon the challenges of doing fieldwork in and about Libya and Syria from the vantage point of neighboring countries under current conditions of instability and pandemic-related difficulties. It will highlight the importance of an approach that takes into account both the longue durée of transnational connectivity in the region, as well as the grassroots perspectives of displaced communities, communities inhabiting specific neighborhoods in host countries, from which they continue creating new spaces for political and social transformation, unbounded by national containers. There could be few people more suited to address this and to precisely take us to the very work of how to research these questions than our speakers tonight. It is my very great pleasure to introduce two emerging but already quite well established scholars who've done field work and published their work in various fields, covering the two regions under perspective for tonight, and to have also our distinguished Professor Randi Deguilhem, who will offer reflections and responses to the presentations. For the sake of time, I shall keep my introduction of the three speakers very short. I apologize for this. I'm not listing all the publications and honors, but want to give just a brief spotlight on who they are to those of you who don't know them yet. I will start with Charlotte Al-Khalili. She is a social anthropologist whose work focuses on the Syrian revolution and on the Syrian revolution in and through exile. Her PhD, which was part of an ERC project on anthropologies of revolution, was entitled "Of Revolutionary Transformations, Life in Displacement at the Syrian-Turkish Border." She has done extensive field work in this regard at the Syrian-Turkish border for the research and post-doctoral research as well later on, where she has mainly worked with women. She is a co-editor of a book to be published at UCL Press entitled "Afterlives of Revolution, Radical Politics Beyond Rupture and Event." Her two most recent articles published in Focal and Al-Jumhuriyya focus on Syrian halqas and revolutionary circles and on the meaning of revolution and defeat in the Syrian context. Currently, she is an honorary research fellow at UCL Anthropology and an affiliated researcher at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. The second, Charlotte will be speaking first. The second speaker of tonight is Dr. Valentina Zagaria, who joined the research project Striking from the Margin in the second phase. She is based in Tunis and contributes from there to our gender focus. Valentina is a postdoctoral research fellow, as I said, at our project, and with a rather recent PhD in anthropology, which she earned from the London School of Economics and Political Science, with the title "Burning Borders, Migration, Death and Dignity in a Tunisian Coastal Town." She was based for that work already before our project for 2 years in Tunis, where she did ethnographic research and examined how dignity, responsibility, and belonging are shaped and curtailed by different migratory projects and gendered expectations in a post-revolutionary context. She has published in a range of academic and journalistic venues, including the Cambridge Journal of Anthropology, American Behavioral Scientist, Open Democracy, and others. As part of our project, Striking from the Margins, her new research connects her and focuses on intimately political aspects of Libyan women's lives while long-term and intermittent exiles in Tunisia. I should also mention, because this is about field work and neighborhood and the intimacy of lives, that she is also founder of an international theater company for whom and with whom she writes and directs theater ethnographically. Sensa, it is called. Last but not least, and probably in this context doesn't really need an introduction, is Professor Randi Deguilhem, who is the discussant of the two papers for tonight. And we are very grateful that she accepted the invitation to join us for this. She is, as you know, a leading scholar in modern and not so modern history of Syria and the Middle East. She is professor at the CNRS in Aix-en-Provence in France. And her name is associated, I think, in the first place with the many, many works and foundational work she did on the Waqf and Islamic law in the region and in the lands of Syria from Ottoman period through the Mandate to the modern time. There is a long list of publications on this. Her other research focus rests on gender analysis and gender issues, again with an approach to the longue durée, looking at specific institutions, the Waqf I already mentioned, but here it is the educational systems, and has published widely in this field as well. At her university, she directs the university-wide GenderMed, Thinking Gender in the Mediterranean network. And in her capacity of directing it, she has directed and partnered and initiated a number of conferences and other events that led to a multitude of publications. I should mention one other platform, as it were, for which she is in charge, which is the Hawa Journal of Women of the Middle East and the Islamic World Journal, which is published at Brils and which she co-directs with Professor Abu Sharaf. I shall rest the brief bio introductions here and move directly on to the speakers and the presentations of tonight. We have agreed that the two speakers will provide short glimpses into their work of some 15 minutes or so, and which will be followed directly by Professor Deguilhem's comments and remarks, to which the two will have a chance to respond, and then we open the floor for discussion. Dr. Charlotte Al-Khalili will be first with her paper entitled From the Political to the Social, the Speed and Depth of Revolutionary Transformations. Charlotte, the floor is yours. And let me not forget, I mean, everybody knows now, but we say it as a routine, please keep your microphones muted during the session.
Hi, thank you very much, Nadia and Valentina. Just want to check if everyone can hear me well. Yeah. So in my presentation today, I will examine the unexpected consequences of the Syrian revolution on the Syrian social fabric in exile, on gender roles and norms, as well as the reshaping of the Syrian Beit, that is both one's extended family and one's home. I argue that by looking at Syrian women's experience of the revolution and exile, one understands how a defeated revolution nonetheless has a transformational power that exceeds its first aim. Indeed, if the Syrian revolution initially aimed at overthrowing the Assad regime, over the years, there has been a shift from the political domain to the social sphere, a shift that is simultaneously scalar, since transformations are no longer operating at the scale of the state, but rather at the intimate one of the family and at the level of women's very selves. By linking together revolution and social change in exile, this presentation challenges the classic failure-success dichotomy that is predominant in the history and historiography of revolutions. Moreover, it suggests to conceive of revolution as processes rather than singular events. This presentation is based on long-term ethnographic fieldwork with Syrian women in the border city of Gaziantep between 2014 and 2017. These women were mainly Sunni Arabs from the lower and lower middle classes and from middle-sized towns. They participated in the revolution in various ways, from taking part in protests to cooking for protesters, and they were subsequently displaced to Turkey by the revolution's repression, often without male or older relatives. In this presentation, I propose to follow my interlocutor's interpretation in understanding the effects of the Syrian Revolution as a series of deep and superficial ruptures. Indeed, over the course of my 2 years of fieldwork, during which I shared Syrian families' lives and homes, the revolution's shape and meaning changed for my interlocutors. As the situation deteriorated inside Syria, the rebels increasingly lost territories and the conflict turned into a proxy war. The possible success of the revolution slowly shifted from the present to a distant future, from the political to the social domain, and from the national to the intimate scale. By describing my female interlocutors' struggles inside and outside their homes, I highlight often overlooked revolutionary actors and spaces, describing the continuity of their struggles in the streets and in their homes, as well as inside and outside Syria. I show that Syrian women are not passive victims of war, as they are often portrayed, but were active political actors and powerful agents of social change. By taking seriously my interlocutors' claims and understanding of continuities between their political struggles and the transformation of their social and intimate lives, I propose to make sense of Syrian women's questioning of gender ideology. Hence, the aim is not to describe these processes in terms of emancipation or empowerment, but rather to analyze processes of transformation of gender structures and meanings. If we get rid of Assad, we would still have to get rid of all the tyrants in our homes, told me once Rasha, a 30-year-old teacher from Homs, who had recently come to Turkey with her 2 young children and her husband. She told me that, as we were discussing the future of the revolution, developing her thought, Rasha explained that it was not only the regime's authority in Syria, but also men's authority within the home that should be dismantled. The idea that for women, the struggle against the regime and its defeat would be incomplete without a struggle against what Rasha described as oppression within families was actually quite widespread among my female interlocutors. The political revolution against the regime had to translate into a social one within Syrian homes. In other words, it had to destabilize the patriarchal bargain in political and intimate domains. The first happened in the struggle against the regime on the streets. For instance, Rasha joined the peaceful protest of 2011 in Homs. She was later forced to flee to the city's liberated areas, where she trained as a nurse to help remedy the lack of medical staff and the growing number of injured. But women's challenge to the patriarchal bargain also took place within their homes. Zain, a mother of 2 and a housewife in her mid-20s from Rif Dimashq, did not participate in street protests because she had only recently given birth. She nevertheless described herself as an active member of the revolutionary struggle. She had lived in Bisil Ghouta for years, where she cooked and knitted for the rebels. Through what were perceived as revolutionary activities, she made her husband accept that she would be going outside of her home by herself and taking major household decisions. In participating in the revolution, women thus started to see themselves as powerful political actors and define themselves as revolutionaries. Moreover, the changes in their everyday and selves had effects not only on themselves, but on their families and the organization of the Beit, which encompasses the material house, the home, and the family lineage. Indeed, the patriarchal logic and the patrilineal organization of the Beit were first shaken by women's participation in the revolution, and later reinforced by displacement. The social rupture my female interlocutors perceived as a simultaneous or consecutive struggle to the political one, thus translated into very pragmatic and everyday issues. Moreover, displacement amplified these changes that were perceived and experienced ambivalently. To illustrate this transformation, I will give a quick description of one family, Umiazans. Before the revolution, Umiazan, a lower middle class housewife from Hama and a mother of 5 in her mid-50s, dedicated most of her time to her children, grandchildren, and household. Her family lived within walking distance of her house, and her social life was mainly organized around family visits. When I met Umiazan in January 2015, she was living alone with her 2 youngest daughters. Her husband was still in Syria, negotiating her son's release from regime jails, and one of her daughters was living in a town under regime control with her own husband and toddler. As with Umiazan's family, all the families I lived with were affected in one way or another by the involvement in the revolution, its repression, and their subsequent displacement. This left them scattered between different cities and countries. Turkey was thus a rather female space for my interlocutors, as it was marked by the absence of their male relatives. This absence led to dramatic household disruptions and changes in women's roles and statuses. However, through Umiazan's family story during the revolution, one starts to perceive how women's participation in the revolution was the first cause of this restructuration. Indeed, Umiazan's life changed dramatically during the time of the revolution. Her life mainly happened within her home before that, while during the revolution and later in displacement, she spent the majority of her time outside her home. Umiazan challenged her restricted mobility during the revolution as her movements increased as she collected and distributed money and goods to internally displaced families. At this time of the uprising, women were perceived as belonging, they were still perceived as belonging in the private sphere of the home, and they were thus not primary suspects when it came to revolutionary activities. In fact, women used their gender identity and perceptions of themselves as victims of the ongoing violence to circumvent the army and security forces. So this was especially true in the uprising first phase. However, the revolution did not increase the mobility of older women only. It is also younger women who challenged patriarchal and patrilineal logics in the revolution. For example, Umiazan's eldest daughters, Sarah and Raya, who were in their mid-20s, fled Syria because Sarah had been arrested and Raya had been wanted by the regime for active participation in revolutionary activities. They had to flee to Turkey alone as their parents were caring for siblings and relatives remaining in Syria. They thus started to live without any relatives in Gaziantep at a time when the Syrian presence in the city was still discreet, thereby enabling to reinvent social dynamics present in Syrian neighborhoods. In Turkey, they also found their first jobs and started to socialize in non-sex segregated spaces. This represented an important change as they had previously only been allowed to go out with a male relative, and they would never have been allowed to spend a night outside of their family home. These were certainly linked to the exceptional circumstances, but it was also linked to the fact that they had asserted themselves as independent political actors and subjects by participating in the revolution. By fighting against the regime's authority, they simultaneously fought against societies and their families' authorities, as expressed by Russia. Their role in the revolution pushed them to challenge and change their roles within their families. Here, the political and domestic fields cannot be conceived of separately. Hence, through the revolution, women began to challenge former understandings of the roles of mother, wife, and daughter, bringing new dimensions to the dominant gender discourse through their revolutionary actions. In this regard, it seems that the 2011 revolution led to the rupture from which emerged a female, if not a feminist, consciousness among my interlocutors, and which has thereby inscribed itself within a revolutionary discourse and a political consciousness. But if this started with the revolution and its repression, it was also amplified by the main consequence of that repression, forced displacement. Here, displacement operates as an incubator for transformation and as an intensifier of social change. In fact, the absence of relatives and acquaintances allowed or forced, depending on one's perspective, my female interlocutors to socialize and move in non-sex segregated spaces. In Turkey, they started to work outside their homes and became their families' main providers. They were running most of the errands their husbands and sons had been previously in charge of. However, this was not always easy and was not necessarily seen as empowering, for it was linked to the absence and loss of relatives. And for most of my interlocutors, it was linked to a life in precarious situations. So focusing on rather overlooked revolutionary actors and transformations, in this presentation, I have argued that the Syrian revolutionary project, despite having been defeated in the political domain at the national scale, still has a transformational power. It can be identified at the level of the constitution of subjects, social relations, mode of dwelling, temporality, future horizons, and imaginative modes. Moreover, processes of social transformations were understood and experienced by my interlocutors as bringing both social and political change. Social transformations were to precede and lead to a future political rupture, rather than being the result of it. Indeed, the defeated revolution at the level of politics still produced a series of deep ruptures in the social field, within debate in gender relations, roles, norms, and practices. Furthermore, this rupture was qualified by my interlocutors as irreversible and long-term, deeper than the defeated rupture at the political level, but it was also perceived as the condition of possibility for future and irreversible rupture to occur in the political realm. This deep rupture was understood as the real revolutionary transformation that would eventually lead to a political revolution in a distant future. The depth of the rupture was thus judged by its permanence, radicalness, and future revolutionary potential, while social rupture was perceived as and became a revolutionary entity and a transformative force in its own right. Yet, 10 years after the beginning of the Syrian uprising and over 6 years after the beginning of my research, one might ask what remains of this revolutionary transformation and whether these processes have been or can be reversed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for your presentation and for your insight into what you have laid out for us as your own observation in the field and the how shall we say, the larger implications this may have. We will have opportunity to discuss this, but we want to first listen to Valentina Zagaria's paper on post-revolutionary political imaginaries and women solidarity networks between Tunisia and Libya. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadia. So I would first like to join you in thanking Randi and Charlotte for having accepted our invitation to join this Striking from the Margin seminar. It is truly an honor, and I cherish the opportunity to also think about what I have learned in these past months of working with the Libyan community alongside your experiences from Syria and Turkey. And thank you also to everyone who tuned in today for combating Zoom fatigue and engaging in our discussion. My presentation will truly comprise of field notes from the neighborhood, as due to lockdowns and other pandemic-related difficulties, I was only able to start fieldwork proper here in Tunis in February, and it is still very much ongoing. I will therefore be presenting the context in which I am attempting to do ethnographic fieldwork, my main research questions, and some preliminary thoughts on gender and transformation in the transnational space created by Libyans moving in and out of Tunisia and Libya since the 2011 revolutions in both countries. I will start off by telling you a bit about who Libyans in Tunisia are and the different reasons and timings of their arrival in this neighboring country. Libyans in Tunisia are a heterogeneous group. They come from all sorts of backgrounds and regions, although perhaps the majority are from the west, from Tripolitania, which borders Tunisia. Among them are Gaddafi supporters who fled to Tunisia, mainly in 2011, during and after the 8 months of revolution and armed conflict that ended with the capture and killing of Gaddafi. But there are also revolutionaries, people who were escaping both NATO airstrikes and Gaddafi's loyalist and mercenary attacks, and all the people in between, who today, depending on the context, reminisce on the revolution and its pitfalls and gains. After 2014 and Haftar's Operation Dignity, there was another surge in the number of arrivals from Libya to Tunisia. But on top of these larger numbers of people arriving in times of intensified fighting, such as these, there are also individuals, families, or entire neighborhoods who escaped specific threats, the many smaller civil wars that are part of the larger conflict, and who came to Tunisia seeking temporary or more long-term safety. As a Libyan analyst put it, since there is no single authority ruling over the whole territory or even over specific locales, danger and violence can quickly escalate, but can also dissipate, allowing people to flee to Tunisia when necessary, but then also to return. Thus, by mapping and tracing the different reasons and timings of arrivals and returns of Libyans to and from Tunisia, one could put together a sort of recent history of Libya since 2011 that takes into account both smaller and larger events, as well as the protracted hardships faced by the population both in Libya and Tunisia. However, there were also Libyans who had moved to and worked in Tunisia prior to 2011, who had been doing business here since before the revolution, and who have continued working in both countries. Many also came to Tunisia for tourism, some owning houses in places such as the island of Jerba, for example, and for medical tourism, both practices having been common among Libyans during Gaddafi's rule. Many of the wounded of and since 2011 have been treated in Tunisia, mostly in private clinics, catering particularly to Libyans in cities like Tunis, Sfax, or Sousse. There are also Tunisian Libyan families, and it is usually mothers who are Tunisians and fathers who are Libyan, thereby more commonly only conferring the Libyan nationality to children. Kinship ties are particularly strong in the border region in southeastern Tunisia. And it is these different and more historical networks that were activated in 2011 and beyond to support and integrate Libyans fleeing into Tunisia. It's also important to mention that most embassies and international organizations working on Libya have also relocated to Tunis, and Libyans are involved in working as consultants and as INGO employees from Tunisia. Finally, there are also women, LGBT people, artists, writers, and journalists who expressed that they came to Tunisia because they could not live a normal life in Libya. Normal referring not only to the war, but to the discriminations, social control, and societal values that they did not recognize as their own, and for the overcoming of which they also took to the streets during the revolution. Despite encountering some of the same difficulties in Tunisia, many stayed either because of the impossibility of traveling elsewhere due to visa impositions, or because Tunisia's proximity to Libya allows them to remain engaged in the country and to travel back, thereby continuing to maintain social ties and engagements in Libya without having to face the daily difficulties, sexism, and discriminations that drove them to leave in the first place. And it is particularly on women belonging to this group that I will focus on later in the presentation. So despite Libyans in Tunisia constituting the largest Libyan community abroad, estimations in 2011 of how many Libyans were in the country went up to 1 million out of a population of 6 million, although numbers are not very reliable as the Tunisian state does not keep clear records of numbers of residents separate from number of entries into the country. They are often not thought about as political actors contributing to Libya's transition out of conflict. Succeeding Tunisian governments since 2011 have tried to remain neutral in neighboring Libya's conflict. And while they allowed Libyans to enter easily on free 3-month tourist visas that are obtained directly upon entry, Libyans are not formally allowed to organize politically in Tunisia. What is more, Tunisia is yet to pass a law that would make its signing of the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention applicable in national jurisdiction. Asylum claims are therefore currently processed in Tunisia by the UNHCR, which has granted very few refugee statuses to Libyan asylum seekers. Libyans in Tunisia are therefore mostly in the country on tourist visas, which they must renew, or have temporary residency permits, which I can assure you are very difficult to obtain. They are not therefore the recipients of any explicit protection on the part of either the Tunisian state or the UNHCR, and do not benefit from any particular humanitarian aid. If there are Libyan families in need in Tunisia, the Tunisian Red Crescent might step in, as they would through their limited means with any national or foreign vulnerable person. A few other organizations, such as, for instance, Terre d'Asile Tunisie, a French organization, can provide punctual aid, and by and large, Libyans in Tunisia make do by themselves amidst an ambiguous gray zone of residency, largely ignored by global humanitarian management nexuses, and living among a Tunisian population which tends to regard them as infinitely wealthier than them, even though that might not be true in the slightest, and by whom they are often overcharged and treated differently, or at least this is how many Libyans I spoke to feel. Several political science researchers and commentators have pointed out that perhaps because of this lack of official recognition, Libyans in Tunisia are not as vocally organized in transnational associations and activism compared to less numerous Libyan diaspora groups residing in Europe and North America. As Huda Mezeudet shows, some communities in the USA, such as Washington, have had more leverage to support, for instance, the GNA in exchanges with the UN. I would, however, argue that the 2011 revolution in Libya opened up a space for social and political transformation that is not solely linked to processes of state fragmentation and reconstitution. It is precisely by virtue of their displacement in neighboring Tunisia and in their movements between Tunisia and Libya that Libyans can keep engaged in perhaps more long-term societal transformation, which is also inextricably political, and thus have a role in rebuilding the country. It is by focusing on their comings and returns and on the networks of mutual aid and employment that make their life in Tunisia possible, especially for women and families, that I hope my research will contribute to showing how different, collective, more livable futures are being experimented with between Tunisia and Libya, centering on processes of transformation of gender roles and relations. For several of the Libyan women I'm working with, mostly in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and working on or participating in different ways in consulting or cultural and civil society projects, who were the easiest, I guess, people for me to come into contact with in pandemic times when it's much, much harder to approach people and be invited into their homes and get to know a wider variety of people, unfortunately, although I'm not giving up, but these are the people I've worked with mainly so far that I've been able to get to know. So for these young women, Tunisia represents a place from which they can go back and forth to Libya and thus entertain relations and concrete material ties to the country. Theirs is a physical, albeit intermittent, presence in both Tunisia and Libya. They also often consider Tunisia as a place for training in civil society capacity building, in research methods, and in transition and democracy training. Through interactions with international organizations who have been organizing since the revolutions, innumerable conferences and trainings in Tunisia targeting Libyans. Yet, it is mainly by hearing about the ways in which they interact with their embassy and consular services, as well as with Tunisian authorities and their employers, and how they develop a sort of social protection from below outside of these interactions, made up of networks of mutual aid, support, and solidarity that also include Tunisians, that their understanding of what they need a state for, what issues they would like a state to address, and what the state should be responsible for in their lives emerge, as well as their hopes and practices aimed at societal change. The 2011 revolutions also had an impact on the ways in which Tunisian and Libyan women engaged in the revolutions were, in their aftermath, able to imagine each other, and on the ways in which they could create discussions around transformation and the possibilities and urgencies opened up by the revolution when it comes to gender-based violence, sexism, and discrimination. Who should provide for who, especially if male family members are absent? How does a population that did not get to formulate political demands during 42 years of dictatorship now negotiate what the state should be responsible in doing for them? What does social security from below involve for these women, and what kinds of safety nets do they feel they need? These are difficult questions to address at a time when the everydayness of how support structures operate happens in intimate spaces, friendship circles, and behind closed doors, where people might be shielding to protect themselves and family members from the coronavirus. Focusing on the circulation and mobility of especially women between Tunisia and Libya as the site for the creation of political imaginaries for a future Libya is also difficult at a time of pandemic-related border closures. Yet it has highlighted the importance of this closeness to Libya for the women I have come to know in Tunis, despite this closeness also at times leading to heightened social control and discomfort, as they try nevertheless to find and maintain some kind of normality, always with an eye to returning and establishing it in Libya too.
Thank you very much, Valentina. We had two very rich and in-depth presentations. Randi, it's your turn to share with us your comments and reflections.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nadia, for the introduction that you gave at the very beginning of this session. And I would like to say that I'm very honored to participate in the Striking from the Margins seminar. I knew about it from for the last few years, and I listened to one or two of the other sessions, and I found it absolutely innovative, very, very interesting. And especially this session organized around research on field notes from the neighborhood, a very interesting perspective, gender and transformation in Libya and Syria. I would like to thank Nadia, with whom I've had the pleasure of working on different projects, to invite me to collaborate in this session. And I would also like to thank Aziz Al-Azmeh, who also co-organized the research program Striking from the Margins. I have a couple of remarks that I would like to give on these really excellent presentations given just now by Charlotte Al-Khalili and Valentina Zagaria. I took some notes, and at the very end of my few minutes, I hope, of my presentation, of my remarks, I will go to them. So I've entitled these remarks as I thought about the research of these two young researchers, Valentina and Charlotte. I organize my thinking anyway around the idea of forced displacement, even though especially in the last presentation, we see people going back and forth, which was the case before the Libyan revolution, going back and forth between Libya and Tunisia. This was very often the case for various reasons, but even so, now it's different. Forced displacement and the immediacy of transforming lives and gendered roles, outside in, inside out. With the reference to Charlotte and Valentina's research, it doesn't seem to be so much a situation for the cases studied concerning Libyan refugees in Tunisia and Syrian refugees in Turkey, especially in Gaziantep. That's where the field research was conducted. It's not the same, it seems to me, and I'd like to have your idea on this, it's not the same as in other cases where forced displacement is a consequence of losing one's country to another political force. I'm thinking here, especially in the days in the last week or two, I'm thinking here of Palestine, of Palestinian forced displacement in 48 and 67 and 74 and between those years, all the forced displacement that went on. Can we think of the women, especially in that situation of forced displacement, can we think of them as falling into another category in terms of categorization, theorization about what's going on here? Can we think about them falling into another category, but nonetheless, very often staying in neighboring countries? In other words, Palestinians going to Lebanon, going to Jordan, which was not Jordan with the same boundaries as today, even though the boundaries still move, going on to Egypt and then going on to other places. It's a long-term refugee situation, but in the very beginning with hopes of early return. I mean, return in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. Are they going to return at 51, 55, and etc.? Same thing with or not the same thing, but on a personal level with the Syrian refugees in Turkey, also in the other neighboring countries, with the Libyan refugees in Tunisia, especially, but also in Egypt, but especially in Tunisia. Do they think of themselves, do these women, do these men think of themselves as refugees who will be able to return home soon? Do they think of themselves as long-term refugees? Are they projecting into the future, their first generation? Do they think of their children as second-generation refugees? How do the children, the boys and the girls, think about themselves with respect to the country which was left behind? I wanted to say something then about that without staying too long on that topic, but how do the refugees see themselves? During your interviews, how do they identify themselves within the existing circumstances? Within the existing circumstances of existing gendered roles and the necessity of, or the forced necessity of transforming those roles in the immediacy of the situation, evolving, transforming in the new circumstances just to survive, and perhaps in some cases to even thrive. At the end of this these brief remarks, I wanted to go to that idea. I've read quite a bit about, with interviews with refugees, especially Syrian refugees in Turkey, but not only, having, as somebody, I think it was at the end of Valentina's presentation, having an open space, the revolution presenting, Charlotte also spoke about that, the revolution presenting more of an open space or a new space in which to identify one's gendered roles, not staying in the same gendered roles as for necessity's sake. It wasn't sometimes even just a choice, but to survive, to put food on the table, so to speak, for themselves, for their husbands, for their children. I would like to also say something about political violence. The political violence in the different situations which the two speakers mentioned, the political violence on the body, the political violence on the structure of the family, which of course also means economic violence, but personal violence on the very intimate level, sexual violence, rape, violence within the household. Even today, we know with COVID, there have been many studies in France, but I guess in other countries, I'm sure in other countries as well, how violence, the conjugal violence, has risen astronomically. So how does that also, COVID is there as another element with the Libyan refugees in Tunisia and the Syrian refugees in Turkey. COVID is also another element here to be thought about within the context of forced migration. And here I would like to say forced to the margin, because striking from the margins, now they're outside. Do they look at themselves as outside in? Do they look back at that country that they left as a country of desire or as a country of refusal? Do they refuse now that life back there as they are restructuring their lives, as they're restructuring the lives of their children, a profound transformation, of course, of their own life. I want to also just to say something about, very quickly, the anthropology of borders. Even though there, and you mentioned it, there are existing networks, familial networks, professional networks, many different other economic trade networks between the countries which are studied here. In other words, Tunisia, Libya, Libya, Tunisia, Turkey, southern Turkey, but not just, southern Turkey, and mostly northern Syria, not just. Those networks which existed beforehand, how are they redefined? How do women redefine them, but also men? Because when we talk about gender, of course, we're not just talking about women, but how do women and men redefine those networks and restructure them also? I would like to also, I think you probably worked on or looked at Dawn Shatty's work, who studied the situation mostly for Kurds. I mean, recently for Kurds, but not just only. And she studied this idea of redefinition of one's self within these existing networks and the creation of new networks. The daily adaptation of the first generation, because we're already 10 years, went so quickly, more than 10 years after 2011, after the beginning of that first spark of revolution, outbreak of revolution. But as a historian, Nadia mentioned it, I always look back to the 19th century or even more. This 2011 is just, it's a moment in time, but there were many other moments in time. At the end of the Ottoman period, well, the end of the 19th, early 20th, there was the Nahda movement, which we can say a lot about, because many of those, I won't get into it now, but many of those elements existing in the claiming of citizenship, the claiming of participation, participatory government, those were already thought about. And then those who study Syria, or those who study other areas say that was stopped sort of like in its, well, I wouldn't say in its infancy, because it was worked on for 2-3 decades during, or 4 decades during Nahda, but it was stopped pretty, it was stopped sort of like in one strike with a mandate, which completely represented something else. But those ideas transited along, nonetheless, during the mandate period and during other periods, the colonial periods, into today. So we find a lot of the same discourse today, 2011. I'm certainly interested in the interviews that you did. We find a lot of the discourse already talked about at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and during the 40, 50, 60 years of independence, breaking out now in the 2011 revolution. That's first generation, those refugees going to Turkey, those refugees going to Tunisia. But what about their children? Children grow up very quickly. They left at the age of 8, 7, 9, 10. Now they're teenagers, now they're young adults. How do they look back at that country that they left? Do they want to return to it? What do they want to do if they do return to that country? How do the women see that country which they left? How do they see that country in terms of their own futures? I would like to just, I don't want to go over my time, but I would like to just mention the scholarship on South America, because as we know, South America has also and is now the nexus of lots of forced migration. And there's just one study, there's a lot of them, but there's one study that I would just like to mention. A study that was published in 2018. It's called A South American Migration Crisis, Venezuelan Outflows, Test Neighbors' Hospitality. So in this case, it's Peru. It's Venezuela, Peru. In other words, how does the host country, you mentioned it both of the presentations, how does the host country define these refugees? And these refugees who are now marrying into families in Tunisia, even though there are many Libyan Tunisian families already mixed, but those new refugees marrying in to the already established families there. That's another, I think that's another element which needs to be looked at. I forgot to mention, Nadia, just give me 2 or 3 more minutes, please. I forgot to mention that the author of this study, the South American Migration Crisis, who studied Venezuelan refugees going to Peru, his name is Nicholas Parent, and he previously conducted research in Turkey on host country perceptions of Syrian refugees. So it's just interesting to look at his work, and also on a comparative basis to see what was the situation in South America with the same parameters that you have set up for your own research of the neighborhood, the neighboring countries hosting, sometimes forced hosting, if that's the word, forced hosting of these refugees. So I would just finish now with a few questions for both presenters. Charlotte, it sort of shocked me in a way, but I guess it's true nonetheless, maybe. When you spoke about the defeated revolution in Syria, I don't want to see it really as defeated. I mean, you spoke about this. I would like to know what you mean by this, the defeated revolution in Syria, which nonetheless has a transformational power that exceeds its first aim. I think I took that from your notes. Overthrow of the regime is the first aim. But it was defeated, yes. Many of those people now are in jail, they're killed, or they're in exile. There are some still in the country. But is it really, my question is it really defeated? Are those is the young generation, which I mentioned before, I've spoken with a number of them in France, who came here as youngsters, very young, 7, 8, 9 years old, who are now teenagers. They don't see the revolution as defeated. They see it as continuing, but outside the borders. I was just wondering what you would have to say about that. You know, I'm talking really about the third way, la troisième voie. I'm talking about that. And I don't know, I have no idea really, how do the Libyan young ones, the young, very young men and women, or the teenagers, the Libyan refugees in Tunisia, how do they position themselves vis-a-vis this idea of defeated revolution? Is it defeated revolution? So that's one. And I don't have time for all the other ones, but I could go back perhaps to ask you a question. My very last question for Valentina, talking about, because I don't know if this is really the case as much. It was the case with the Alexandretta Sanjak in 1939 being given to Turkey, but that's generations ago. So those networks don't exist in the same way, or they're very loose. However, between Libya and Tunisia, and I know some of them because they were students here, Libyan students who went back to work in Libya, many of them had Tunisian mothers. That's really interesting, as you mentioned that. They had Tunisian mothers, but of course they don't hold Tunisian nationality. They only have Libyan Tunisian, they only have Libyan nationality, but they go back and forth. But now, what is that situation? How do they go back and forth? Is it the same? What kind of impact, that's another word I wanted to ask you about. What kind of impact do they have in the both situations, Syria and in Libya, on the host countries, and the impact on them and their impact on the networks in their home countries? I think, Nadia, I went over my time, so I should stop, I think.
Not at all. Thank you very much. No, I think this is added to the two presentations that we had by the anthropologists that by definition and by discipline, right, focused much more on spatial and other social configurations to bring in that question of temporality. Is not surprising to get from a historian, but I think really adds a lot of depth to what we've already heard. So Charlotte, do you want to go first? And then Valentina, and then we open also to others. I think there's quite a lot now of these of the talks and ideas that we received, or others would like to come in as well. Charlotte, it's yours first.
Yeah. Thank you, Randi, for your question. And I mean, for me, I picked up, I was writing notes while you were giving your comments, and I thought there were other questions as well, but I don't know if I should answer them now as well. I'm using the term defeated first because it's my interlocutor's term, but also because it allows a distinction, and it's a distinction that an anthropologist of the Egyptian revolution did, Walter Ambrose, about failure and success. And usually he notes that as I was saying, that in the history and historiography of revolution either succeed or fell, and those that fell are not remembered. and end up in the dustbin of history. And in a way, maybe not within the seminar, but in general, the Syrian revolution is not perceived as a revolution simply because it did not overthrow the Syrian regime. So I'm starting from that point, and also from my interlocutors' understanding of the situation that obviously like evolved during the years, because it was not the same perception in 2013, the first time I went to Turkey, and in 2019 when I left. But most of the people I work with, and they were all defined themselves as revolutionaries. So in the end, the revolution is defeated. But I guess the twist here is that it is defeated on the political level because it did not, and at the national scale, because it did not lead to the overthrow of the regime. Yet it's not totally defeated, and it's continuing obviously outside Syria and inside Syria on like in the intimate scale. And like when we see like what this kind of social transformations I was describing, and it's here that the temporality is very important. That's why I was speaking of depth and speed of transformation, because the political rupture that should have happened quite quickly, or at least in the kind of ideas that Syrians had of the revolution, and it was based on the experience in Tunisia and Egypt, that it will happen very quickly or maximum in a couple of years, did not happen. But now there is this hope, and also among the younger generation, as you were mentioning, that it did not happen yet on the political level, but all this social transformation will push and lead to a bigger political transformation. And often people were telling me, like, if not, in a generation, in 100 years. So there is this idea that things will eventually like happen. And there is really this, you were mentioning it as well, it's very interesting. They really are thinking of the revolution as a process on the longue durée, and speaking of the former revolts, rebellions, and uprisings in Syria and within the region. And they really inscribed the 2011 revolution in this lineage of revolution and in continuity with them. So it's not, they don't see it as isolated and failed event. And now I understand in this perspective why you're saying that, but that's why I'm speaking of defeat. And I will let Valentina answer, and then if you want, I can go back to some of the other question about the relation with Syria and the situation in Turkey.
Thank you so much, Randi. That was a really rich response. I don't know where to begin in responding, but I guess just bouncing off what you said about transformation in gender roles as happening out of necessity and survival, and not necessarily being seen as a good by all women. That's absolutely the case in Tunisia, in women in Tunisia. So definitely the women that I worked with most, who are engaged in cultural and organizations and civil society to not have to live with family, to not have family all around, and to be able to have a bit more freedom. Although they're very aware there's Libyans everywhere and there's eyes everywhere still in Tunisia. So it's not at all a neutral space of detachment from the community Tunisia. However, there's some other women that I got to know who came without husbands and sons or uncles or male family members, who do very much talk about the fact that they had to start working, and they had to, sometimes they phrase it as, we had to start behaving like Tunisian women who need to work because Tunisia is a poorer country and we come from a wealthier country. And I'm not too sure that they see this as fantastic. There's definitely gains to having these new roles and responsibilities and being able to earn their own money. But I still think that some of them would argue that if we could, though, we'd still not work because men should be able to sustain us. Not all, it's very complex, but I think it's a good point that you're making, that transformation is happening both as part of a revolutionary project and as a demand and as a kind of struggle that is long-term and continuing, in parallel with what Charlotte was talking about. But it's also happening out of necessity in these neighboring countries where men maybe are more absent, and where women need to make do. Then about children and schooling and younger generations, I'm only starting to work with children. I really wanted to work in, there's 3 different Libyan schools here in Tunis, and I really wanted to try and set up a cinema club with them to try and set up discussions and have a more participative and creative approach to research with children and young people. But unfortunately, due to COVID shutdowns of schools, I haven't been able to yet. But what I found generally is that Libyans are reticent to sending children to Tunisian schools, because Tunisian schools are partly in Arabic, partly in French, and Libyans are not Francophone. So overall, they'd rather, if they're wealthier and have enough money, they send children to international schools, also with a view that maybe one day they'll be able to relocate from Tunisia to elsewhere, and with a view to be able to return to Libya and just follow the Libyan school curriculum. So this is interesting. So I'd say that the fact that the Tunisian state really doesn't recognize officially the presence of Libyans, doesn't quantify how many Libyans there are, doesn't try to give them papers, residency status, or some sort of form, doesn't try to formalize their stay, does make it rather transient. And a lot of Libyans also feel, I think, that Tunisians themselves are fleeing Tunisia because the economic situation is so terrible. So for them, it's unimaginable that Tunisia is a long-term plan. It will always be in and out of Libya, I think, and with an eye to staying in the neighborhood, I guess, but always with an eye to return, I think. While in some cases where the social control was too much and where people really feared for their lives, even in Tunisia, also because I think Libyan activists are very aware that the Tunisian, like Egyptian activists that came to Tunis after their revolution turned very sour, they were very aware that the Tunisian state can't really offer them the protection that they would need. So I think that sort of the most well-known revolutionaries and political activists didn't stay in Tunisia, just like Egyptian activists are almost all gone by now as well, 10 years down the line. And I guess the very last thing I wanted to say, because you've said so much, I don't want to hog time, but what's interesting is that I don't think that the majority of Libyans think of themselves as refugees in Tunisia. So they're definitely not Tunisians. They're definitely not really thinking about their place here as a long-term plan, but they immediately rejected the encampment humanitarian approach that was offered to, of course, the huge numbers of people from other African countries who also fled into Tunisia right after the breakout of the revolution in February 2011. But Libyans always avoid that and used pre-existing networks, and I guess their capital, their economic capital, to establish themselves in houses and hotels. Also, the diaspora sent a lot of money to Tunisia to help Libyans get by as the revolution was unfolding. So it's interesting because I think the Libyan case explodes, as Charlotte was also saying, this idea of the victim and the refugee, and also explodes what diaspora even means. I'm not sure. I think there are other categories that might have to be thought out for what's happening.
And can I just add on this, because this is one of the questions I also wanted to answer to, because it was in your opening remark, and I think that it's actually not only a historical but also an ethnographic parallel that you're making between Palestinian and Syrian, because my Syrian interlocutor were often jokingly speaking of how they would become the new Palestinians. And for example, at the beginning, I mean, when I started my research and up until 2015, there was an open door policy. So Syrians could come and were coming back and forth, Turkey and Syria. And that's why they were based in Gaziantep, because they had, it's very similar, actually, it's very interesting. It's very similar to what Valentina was saying. In Turkey, there is no refugee status. So there is a different status. There's also not the same proportion, the same number. But there's a lot of people going back and forth for a very long time, especially among my interlocutors. And now for their children, they're jokingly saying, so there was really a hope to return quickly. And then this hope started to fade away at different speeds as well, because it depended on where the people were coming from. So there are places that people could still return, but there are places also that people cannot return to at all. So this is one of the issues as well. And I think, at least among my interlocutors now, more than thinking to go back, they're more thinking to go further and like hoping to reach the European Union in a way or another. But the interesting thing is those who don't have the choice and are still in Turkey, they're saying like soon, like referring to the Palestinians of Syria, because there are also a lot of Palestinians in Syria, saying soon will be the Syrians of Turkey. But then there's also this difference, and that's interesting what you were saying about the school, Valentina, because the difference here is that it's not an Arabic speaking country. So at the beginning, there were special schools only for Syrians. And they're like some kind of parallel systems. And in a way, this is something that no European country would have done. Even until now, you can study in Arabic in Turkey in many universities, and there are different status that you can get, but it's quite hard. You don't have a proper refugee status in Turkey nowadays. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that like most people, apart from those who manage to get the Turkish citizenship, do not really think of staying in Turkey. And for the question about children, for me, I didn't work at all with children. It was not allowed in my ethics and risk assessment form. So I worked with youngsters, and obviously I got in touch with children who were in the families, but I wouldn't be able to tell you how a 7-year-old who was now 18 saw the things. But actually, it just reminded me of one anecdote that during my field work, I work with women who were living in orphanages. I mean, we translate by orphanage, but it's like women living with their children who don't have any male relatives anymore. And a 10-year-old went back to Syria by himself, and the mother was freaked out because she didn't understand why he went back. And he went back to his village, and then his uncle told the mother that he was back and sent him back. So there is like still some relations between the two countries, but as I said, most of the time there is no place to go back to.
Nadia, can I say something before?
Of course, Randi, please.
Thank you. Yes, about the school system. I know about the school system in Turkey, accommodating, you could say, accommodating the young refugees, and how they had 2 or 3 sessions per day in the same school setting in order to accommodate those young people that needed to learn Turkish. But I think that is fascinating, because 10 years now down the line, I'm wondering about those little girls and those little boys who are growing up, as all refugees do, in a new environment, in a new system. That is also a very strong impact on their own intimate sense of self. I do have a question. I won't take time, but I do have 2 questions that I would like to ask about the Syrian refugees or exiles in Turkey. Do you have any information about some of them contributing to a website called The Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, which was created the year after, was created 2012 in Beirut by a Syrian woman called Sana Yazigi. Do you know about, because she receives thousands and thousands and thousands of all kinds of SMS, all kinds of films, any kind of creative work on the Syrian Revolution. So her website, The Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, in French, Arabic, and in English. I'm wondering if any of the people, the women, or the other people that you, whom you've interviewed, I'm wondering if any of them mentioned that. That's a question I wanted to ask. And then I just wanted to make one remark real quick. Or any, another question too, or any of those interviews, either Valentina or Charlotte, or any of those interviews that you did you film any of them with the idea of perhaps making a documentary later on down the road? I suppose you must have registered, how do you say, with the sound, but I'm wondering if you filmed any of them. That would be, even with your telephone, that would be interesting. My very, very last for now thing that I want to say is that we were talking before about the new gender roles of women and roles, more public roles. They're going out to work. You know, this is very, very common in post-revolutionary situations. And hopes are also always very high by some of these women that circumstances are going to change in terms of their accessibility to different opportunities. But it's the same case with the Algerian Revolution, the Palestinian revolutions, the Cuban Revolution in South America, and of course, the French Revolution is probably the worst of them all, where women were in the front line, as in the other revolutions. But then a few years or almost immediately afterwards, no citizenship was granted to them, no public space. They were really relegated to, I don't even want to say the house, I would say sort of the basement. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Yes. And then I see that there is now,
yeah, sorry.
We want to also come in, but please do take your time to answer if you want to answer to these questions, but then let us also open to the floor. So who wants to come? You want Charlotte or Valentina? Or both, of course.
Nadia, I think let's gather more questions.
You want to gather more? Okay. So we have, please, Aziz, you were the first to put up. And if you could just articulate it, we can read it, but I think it's better.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these really wonderful talks, and Randi for your extremely suggestive comment. Now, with regard to the move from the political to the social, from the national to the intimate, that was brought out. I was wondering first if there was such a sentiment observable among Libyan women in Tunisia, but in addition to that, and I think more pertinently to my interests, how does one measure, judge, gauge the durability of change of the type that was outlined by you, Charlotte? And would you be able to say anything about the possibility of such a spirit or of such a situation or of such an ambition existing among women who are also accompanied by men? I mean, I say things bearing in mind a variety of experiences, including the experience of Algeria, of the Algerian Revolution, Algerian Independence War, during which women were extraordinarily active at a variety of levels, and where more traditional ties were reasserted immediately after independence. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I answer?
Please go ahead.
Well, I mean, I guess to assess the durability of changes, one should do another research. I mean, I can only see that I've been working in Turkey from 2013 to 2019, and at least among my interlocutors, and obviously in anthropology, it's always like limited in a way, but then it can be compared with other studies. And I'm thinking of Shanae Ozdin's studies, for example, among Syrian women who arrive with their husband, and she's noticing that she's also an anthropologist, the rise in divorces, because in Turkey, the women usually get custody of the children, contrary to Syria. So I think here I want to bring up, I think that maybe the main difference with the Algerian Revolution, but I'm not an expert of the Algerian Revolution, is that here we have revolution and displacement, and we can add to that war. And I think that if we think of the Second World War, for example, and the impact it had on women's role also, and even just on women's dress and this kind of thing, I'm not sure these kind of changes are reversible, but in a way I want to say only the future can say. But I really do think that, and it's something that I try to bring out in my presentation, and that Randi was referring to and Valentina answered to, is that what is important is that it's obviously at the beginning it was brought out by the revolution, but not for all women. Then it's also because of the necessity in displacement, and the fact that in Turkey, sometimes the women are the only one who are going to be employed or more easily employed, for example, by NGOs. So they're going to have higher salary, their role within the household is going to change, even if they are with their husbands or with their father. And I think maybe it's more obvious in generational term rather than in terms of generation, rather than in terms of gender also, is that the younger people and the people who manage to learn another language, whether like pick up Turkish or learn English, are more easily employable. And then it does create a big difference because of the precarity of the situation in Turkey. I don't know if I covered that.
Thank you, Charlotte. No, absolutely. Valentina, you want to also come in on this? You want to share some?
I just wanted to say that I was really struck when reading, I had the pleasure of reading Charlotte's work in the past, and I was really struck by the kind of opposite situation that I think happened in Tunisia with regards to social and political revolutionary demands. And we've had a brief exchange with Charlotte on this already, and I'm referring to this just because my previous PhD research was in post-revolutionary Tunisia, where a lot of people commented on the fact that we've become famous for being this success story internationally of the 2011 revolutions. However, politically, things might have changed, and at that, but yes, while socially, it really, for people, I think it really wasn't a revolution that brought about shifts in both gender and generational relationships. So that struck me as incredibly interesting, that in what Charlotte is describing for Syrians displaced in southern Turkey, that it's almost the opposite perception of political change and social change and what those revolutions were about and can succeed, and the temporalities of that kind of change. With regards to Libyans, I think the main sort of the obvious main difference is that Gaddafi's dead, but nevertheless, civil war did break out. So I don't think people, so to reply to a comment Randi made earlier, I don't think people so much talk of failure, but talk of, was it worth it? And what next? And everything seems so uncertain. And also another thing that Randi was pointing to in terms of economic changes and difficulties, the Libyan people I've met in Tunis really feel like their standards of living have slowly gone down the drain over the past 10 years. And they felt a definite sort of economic advantage compared to Tunisia, or definitely regard Tunisia as a poorer country with less resources compared to Libya. But then after the corruption and squandering and incredible loss of course, life, but also economic means in Libya, I think people are very much concerned as to their future. And this, interestingly, sometimes expresses itself by gender-related tropes, such as something very common that I've heard among Libyans in Tunis is that the situation economically has become so bad for Libyans that Libyan women are having to prostitute themselves in Tunisia, which I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's definitely, but whether it's true or not, this is definitely a massive concern of the Libyan community, that, and a sign of how low we've fallen and how difficult rebuilding is going to be. So already women working is seen by some as sign of really a loss of status of sorts. But then these rumors are also circulating, which sort of reflect a real unease and uncertainty as to the economic stability and possibility for men to be able to provide and get married and build families and futures.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I don't see, if you want to have a question, please just type or raise your hand that we can see this, because I'm very conscious of time. I know that we do need to stop at 7 o'clock because one of our speakers need to leave at 7 o'clock and we don't want to continue without her. So if you don't have urgent question to ask. I would actually propose, since this is a research seminar, right? We do this now in public. It has also the form of, I mean, it is proper presentations, and we really had the privilege of hearing indeed 3 fascinating reflections on work. One thing that I found most amazing listening to you is how the very notion and idea of neighborhood is actually turned around. Neighborhood, which we usually associate with much more stricter control, would say this is the guardian of keeping traditions and certain rules and the way you play the game, and that what you were depicting here from your field work and from your also long-term, maybe not the long durability that we can see yet, but long-term observant participation, or however close you get, that there's obviously also something else going on in these neighborhoods. And I would actually like to invite, if our 3 speakers would be willing to do this again, to have a follow-up session on this after the summer and look a little bit more in, because this is extremely important and fascinating, how borderlands are defined also by this recreation of neighborhoods, but that are then very different neighborhoods. And I think for the purposes of our project, this is quite pertinent, and this is something that I'm taking with me, not only with regard to changing or at least challenge gender roles, obviously also changing, but how these traditional loci are redefined. I would, at this point, with regret, but it is 7 o'clock, like to ask everybody to thank our 3 participants, our 3 speakers for their presentations, for sharing their field notes with us. And this has been extremely enriching. And I thank you very much. And I thank the members of the team and our guests of tonight for joining. And hope to see you again in one of our other sessions. So thank you very much, the 3 of you.